2-3 together. It didn't take UNESCO long inside to Mitchell was to such a great connection. Rebound battled for Clark comes away with it. Caitlin outlet to Aaliyah in stride. She is second in fan votes, third in media votes, and 11th according to her own peers. That is the number sitting inside the WNBA's All-Star voting breakdown. So, the All-Star starters were announced this week. Plenty of familiar faces and it belongs to Caitlin Clark. Fans and analysts see one of the league's most productive guards drawing double teams every single night. Her fellow players saw something else entirely, ranking her behind teammate Kelsey Mitchell and several guards she consistently outproduces. The gap did not stay buried for long. Colin Cowherd called it petty on national television. Candace Parker called it insecurity on her own podcast. Let's get into exactly what happened, who voted her down, and why it backfired instantly. The vote that shocked everyone. All-Star starter voting in the WNBA is not a simple popularity contest. It is a weighted formula built from 3 separate pools of judgment, each carrying its own share of influence over the final outcome. Fans control half the result. Media voters control 1/4 and the players themselves, the women who share the floor with every candidate throughout the season, control the remaining 1/4. On paper, that structure exists to balance star power against basketball substance. She has made the game easier for her teammates because she's been involved in moving the ball. But does giving players a formal vote actually guarantee an honest one? This year's results suggest the answer is more complicated than the league would like to admit. For the first time in recent memory, the internal breakdown of that vote leaked into public view, and it did not flatter the people who cast it. The graphic that circulated showed 3 columns side by side. Fan rank, media rank, and player rank for every guard under consideration for a starting spot. Paige Buchers led the pack with the top fan rank, the second media rank, and the top player rank. A clean sweep that nobody disputed, matching what most observers already believed about her season. Olivia Miles landed second overall, strong across every column. In the 2026 WNBA draft, the Minnesota Lynx select Olivia Miles and led the media vote outright. A testament to a breakout year few saw coming from a rookie guard. Then came Caitlin Clark's row, second in the fan vote, third in the media vote, and then sitting apart from the rest of her numbers like a typo, 11th among the guards on the player's own ballot. Is a 3-column gap that wide ever really an accident? For most players in the league, the 3 numbers move together in a fairly predictable way. A star with fans is usually a star with media, and a star with media is usually respected by the locker room next door because all 3 groups are largely watching the same performances week after week. Clark's row broke that pattern completely, standing out even against a chart already full of disagreements and split opinions across nearly every position on the floor. The distance between her fan rank and her player rank was not a small, forgivable disagreement of the kind that shows up somewhere on every ballot in every sport. It was one of the widest splits on the entire chart, and it quickly became the one detail nobody could stop discussing once the graphic made its way across social media. What made the leak sting even more was its timing to get going. Boston showing that improve. The voting results dropped in the first days of July just as the league was gearing up to promote its All-Star game in Chicago. A showcase built in large part around the exact players whose peers had just quietly voted them down. Could the league have predicted how quickly this would spiral once the numbers went public? Almost certainly not, or the full column-by-column breakdown likely never would have been released in this level of detail. All-Star voting splits are not always published with this much transparency, and the decision to show every gap and every uncomfortable pattern meant anyone could screenshot the chart and send it straight into the center of sports discourse within minutes. Once that graphic started circulating, there was no controlling the conversation around it anymore. The league could not simply announce the final starters and move on to promoting the event. Gets denied by Boston. It had to sit with a public record of exactly how divided opinion was behind the scenes and exactly which player carried the widest gap of them all. Reporters who covered the league day-to-day noted that this was not the first time a voting anomaly had surfaced involving Clark, but it was by far the most detailed and the most public. Previous seasons had produced smaller whispers about how her peers viewed her compared to fans. Quiet comments buried in post-game scrums, rarely backed by hard numbers. This time, the numbers were sitting right there in a single graphic, impossible to dismiss as rumor or exaggeration. Once whispered anecdotes become documented numbers, how does a league credibly wave the story away? That shift from rumor to hard data is exactly what gave the story its staying power through the following week. fan-run accounts began compiling their own side-by-side breakdowns of the three voting columns. Clark was the second and third most voted for guard among the fans and media, respectively, comparing them against box scores from throughout the season. And the more those comparisons circulated, the harder it became for anyone to write the gap off as simple noise inside a crowded ballot. The numbers don't lie. Strip away the voting graphic for a moment, and look only at what Caitlin Clark did on the court this season. 21.2 points a game, 8.2 assists a game. A number that places her among the very best distributors in the league, and one that speaks to how much offensive responsibility runs through her hands every time she steps on the floor. She is not a marginal all-star writing name recognition into a spot she did not earn. Do those numbers look in any honest reading like the resume of the 11th best guard in the league? Nothing in the stat sheet supports that. And that mismatch is where the controversy begins. So, how does a player averaging those numbers land 11th among guards in the eyes of the very people guarding her every single night? Final Four. Let's hear from the players after the game. That question would not go away once the numbers started circulating across sports media. Kelsey Plum, the league's second leading scorer this season, faced a nearly identical situation, 12th on that same list. Despite averaging close to 24 points a night with elite shooting efficiency, two of the league's most productive guards, both pushed toward the bottom of their peers' ballots, both performing at a level that made the ranking look less like a valuation and more like a message. Is that really a coincidence or a coordinated signal? Even players who decline to comment publicly acknowledge that reputation can creep into a ballot filled out quickly between practices and travel days. Doesn't defense usually tell the real story when box scores get disputed? In Clark's case, it tells the opposite story entirely. Opposing teams do not treat her like an 11th ranked guard on any given night. She draws multiple defenders the moment she crosses half court. Crisscross fire. Gets picked up the full length of the floor possession after possession and forces coaches to build entire game plans around limiting her touches. Teams do not spend that kind of defensive capital on a player they consider replaceable. That gap between how Clark is guarded and how she was ranked became for critics the clearest evidence that something other than basketball judgment shaped the vote. Under half of the league's players submitted a ballot this year, a participation rate low enough to call the sample into question. Should a vote with turnout that low carry the same weight as one drawn from the full roster? A rule barring players from voting for their own teammates meant even those who respected Clark's game inside the locker room were mechanically prevented from reflecting that on paper. Low turnout combined with structural limits on who could vote for whom turned what should have been a clean measure of peer respect into something messier. Since the three-point shot wasn't even part of college basketball until 1986, a small uneven sample standing in for a league of more than 100 players. If barely half the league bothered to vote, whose opinion was actually represented on that chart? It was designed as a quiet tiebreaker behind a fan-driven result, not to headline every broadcast for a week. Once it became the story, it carried far more weight than it was ever meant to bear. There is a simpler explanation too, one with less to do with malice and more to do with familiarity. Players who see an opponent only a handful of times a season sometimes rank on reputation rather than repeated experience guarding that player. But does limited familiarity really explain an 11th place finish for a guard averaging nearly 22 points a night? Even the charitable explanations leave room for the same conclusion. Is good in defense by Raven? The vote did not match reality on the floor. The rankings raise questions. Among the names that finished ahead of Clark in the guards ranking was Kelsey Mitchell, her own teammate on the Indiana Fever. The rule barring players from voting for teammates meant Mitchell could not have voted for Clark even if she wanted to. A technical detail that softens the sting of that particular line on the chart considerably. But did that technicality stop critics from highlighting it anyway? Not even close. It captured something larger about the entire situation. Even the players who share a locker room with Clark, who see her workload up close every single day at practice, were structurally excluded from reflecting that respect, where the public could actually see it. The rest of the list read like a roll call of players Clark regularly outproduces possession after possession throughout an entire season. Ryan Howard, Olivia Miles, Sonia Citron, Marina Mabry, and Alicia Gray all finished ahead of her in that same column alongside Paige Buchers at the very top of the guard chart. And Asia Becky said, "I don't have you on film making mistakes yet in training camp." Some of those names had strong statistical seasons in their own right, and earned their place through genuine production on the floor. Mabry tied a single-game scoring record and was putting up numbers among the league's best all year long. Others like Citron were promising young players still building their case as legitimate stars for years to come. If a handful of the names ahead of Clark on that ballot were still establishing themselves, what exactly separated them from her in the eyes of the voters? Nothing in the box score offered a clean answer. And that absence of a clean answer is precisely what kept the story alive well past its first news cycle. But few of them, if any, were facing the kind of defensive attention Clark absorbs simply by stepping onto the floor in an opposing team's building. Why would a locker room undervalue the player opposing coaches fear the most on any given night of the schedule? That contradiction became the center of the entire controversy once it reached a wider audience beyond the league's core fan base to meet, and know, and do an event with her wonderful young lady. It is one thing for fans to disagree with a media panel over a close call late in a game. It is another thing entirely for the players on the floor, the people with the closest, most informed view of who is actually difficult to guard. To rank a player behind names who simply do not draw the same defensive commitment week after week. That mismatch is what turned a routine voting graphic into a story with genuine staying power across sports media outlets. Clark's low ranking from her own peers did not exist in isolation either. It followed a season already defined by physical confrontations, contested officiating decisions, and a growing perception among her supporters that the league was reluctant to fully protect its most marketable player from repeated rough treatment. A flagrant foul earlier in the season, a running debate over inconsistent whistles in games involving the Fever. WNBA called a flagrant foul. The Phoenix Mercury's Alyssa Thomas appears to put her fist on Caitlin Clark's throat. And now a voting snub from the very players she shares a court with. Could any single one of those incidents alone have generated this much sustained attention? Probably not. Stacked together across a single summer, they built a narrative that refused to fade from the news cycle. Supporters pointed to a pattern beyond the vote itself, noting how often Clark seemed to be excluded from moments of institutional recognition, even as she remained central to the league's in-court product and its growing television audience. It was not just one ballot sitting in isolation. It was one more entry in a growing file that fans had assembled across the entire season. And that file was about to grow even larger once the reaction to the vote fully took shape across every major social platform. Even players who had no connection to the vote at all found themselves being asked about it in interviews. A sign of just how far the story had traveled beyond its original context. Broadcasters covering other games that week found the topic impossible to avoid entirely, working references to the vote into pre-game segments, even when the matchup on the floor had nothing to do with the Fever or the guards involved in the controversy. That kind of crossover, a single roster decision bleeding into coverage of unrelated games across the league. And she can stop and pop a shot from mid-range and the three-point line anytime she wants. Is usually reserved for trade rumors or injury news, not a mid-season exhibition vote. Its presence there said as much about the size of the story as any single headline could. When was the last time a mid-season exhibition vote pulled focus away from actual games being played that same night? The backlash begins. The public reaction did not build slowly. It exploded almost immediately after the voting graphic began circulating widely across social media. Fans flooded timelines questioning how a player triple-teamed every time she touched the ball could possibly rank 11th among her peers in a formal vote. One widely shared piece from the comeback carried a headline blunt enough to summarize the entire mood in a handful of words. Everyone needs to be ashamed. Was that just fringe commentary buried in the replies of a random account? No, it was a mainstream sports outlet putting a number on the scale of the outrage building online within hours. Sports media personalities piled on almost as quickly as fans did once the numbers made the rounds across every platform. Colin Cowherd, host of The Herd on Fox Sports, used his platform to call the treatment of Clark plainly petty, pointing directly to the animosity building around her across the internet in real time. He did not treat the player vote as an isolated incident either. He tied it directly back to an earlier controversy from just weeks before when the league unveiled a commemorative poster celebrating 30 years of WNBA history. Hit inside to Mitchell was to have such a great connection. Rebound paddled for Clark comes away with it, and left Clark off it entirely. How does a league leave its most commercially significant player off its own anniversary poster, and expect no one to notice? Can a single voting graphic really carry the weight of an entire season's worth of grievances built up over months of coverage? For Clark's supporters, the answer was clearly yes. And they said so loudly across every platform where the story spread. The All-Star snub did not read as a standalone data point sitting apart from everything else that had happened this season. It read as confirmation of a pattern many believed had been quietly building beneath the surface all season. Road games were relocated to meet the surge in ticket demand whenever she stepped into opposing arenas. A league-wide shift toward private jet travel soon followed, driven largely by the box office draw her appearances generated for every franchise on the schedule. And yet, moment after moment where formal recognition was up for grabs, a commemorative poster, a peer vote from the very players benefiting most from her presence, Clark kept coming up short, particularly in the rooms controlled by those closest to the sport, rather than the millions watching from the outside. The intensity of the backlash forced a question the league could no longer avoid. Was this truly a basketball disagreement? Players simply evaluating the guard position differently than fans and media? Or was something else fueling the numbers? A quiet resentment toward a player whose arrival had reshaped schedules, travel logistics, and revenue streams in ways some veterans never asked for and never fully welcomed. Neither explanation reflected well on the league's internal culture. And the longer the controversy lingered at the forefront of sports discussions, the more pressure mounted on someone with real stature inside the game to speak publicly and settle the matter once and for all. League officials, for their part, offered little public comment, choosing instead to let the debate unfold across sports media without wading directly into the uncomfortable question of how their own players had voted. Even players and executives who stayed silent found themselves fielding questions about the ballot and press availabilities and post-game interviews, unable to escape a story that, within a single news cycle, had become the defining storyline of the All-Star selection process. Local beat writers noticed a noticeable shift in tone at press conferences that week. Reporters were no longer asking only about upcoming opponents, but about a voting graphic none of them had expected to dominate the conversation. How often does a single leak chart reshape an entire week of league coverage? Then Parker broke her silence. That pressure eventually found its outlet in Candace Parker. A 7-time All-Star and one of the most respected voices in the history of the sport, Parker addressed the controversy directly on her podcast, Post Moves, alongside co-host Aaliyah Boston. She did not soften her criticism for the cameras. She pointed out that even during her own playing career, personal rivalries had never stopped her from voting honestly for opponents she respected on the floor, regardless of how she felt about them off it. Does personal rivalry really justify an inaccurate ballot from a professional? Parker's answer, drawn from years of experience, was a firm no. Her comments suggested that whatever kept players from ranking Clark fairly this year had little to do with genuine basketball judgment and far more to do with something else. Parker extended her criticism beyond Clark alone, calling out the low ranking given to Kelsey Plum as well, and framing the entire pattern as something the league needed to confront honestly, rather than dismiss as a statistical anomaly. Her message carried extra weight precisely because of who delivered it. Not a media commentator with no locker room experience, but a former All-Star who understood exactly what it meant to sit down and fill out a peer ballot under real pressure. Does it matter more when criticism comes from inside the sport rather than from outside commentators with no playing background? In this case, it clearly did. And the reaction to Parker's comments proved it almost immediately across sports media. Her remarks spread quickly, lending credibility to a controversy that had, until that point, been driven mostly by fans and outside personalities without direct experience in a WNBA locker room. When a 7-time All-Star tells the current generation of players to look inward and examine their own reasoning, it becomes far harder to dismiss the backlash as an overreaction from people who simply don't understand the professional game. By the time the dust settled, the snub had accomplished the opposite of whatever intention sat behind it. Instead of diminishing Caitlin Clark heading into All-Star Weekend, it amplified the exact narrative her supporters had been building for months, that she remains undervalued by the very players who benefit most from the attention and box office pull she brings to the league every single night. The players who ranked her 11th got their vote counted, exactly as the process allows under league rules. But since when does a technically valid vote guarantee a favorable headline? What they didn't get was control over the story that vote would ultimately tell once it reached the public. The episode also left a lingering question hanging over the league heading into its biggest showcase event of the summer. If a vote this narrow, drawn from under half the roster and stripped of teammate ballots by rule, could generate this much sustained backlash in a matter of days, what happens the next time these numbers go public? Parker's comments suggested the league's own players may need to reconsider how seriously they treat a ballot that, however quietly designed behind the scenes, clearly carries far more public weight than anyone inside the league office ever anticipated. Whether that reconsideration actually happens before next season remains, for now, an open question. For now, The only certainty is this. A vote meant to stay buried in a quiet corner of the All-Star process became instead the single most discussed detail of the entire selection. And every player whose name appeared ahead of Clark's on that chart will carry that association into Chicago, whether they intended it or not. None of it changed the outcome. Caitlin Clark will start for the third consecutive season, walking out under the lights of the United Center in Chicago on July 25th. What changed was the story around her arrival there. A vote meant to stay buried became the most discussed detail of the selection, dragging a legend into the conversation and handing Clark's supporters fresh proof of what they had said all season. The players who ranked her 11th got their vote counted, but they never controlled the headline it created. If this opened your eyes, hit like, drop your take below, and subscribe.